You want to know what's fun? Fairy tales. Stories like Cinderella and the Seven Dwarfs, or Hansel and the Three Bears. Tales that were force fed to us by Walt Disney himself. But you want to know what's more fun than fairy tales? Murder. Unfortunately, there are a few surviving tales focused on raw, unadulterated murder, like Bluebeard. Let's take a look into those gory details, shall we?
The original Bluebeard was created in 1697 by famous fairy tale writer Charles Perrault, author of Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. The main character, Bluebeard, drew inspiration from infamous historical figures such as the famous child serial killer Gilles de Rais. No, Spencer, I mean the real Gilles de Rais. I said the real one! Good. Now, to explore the plot of the original Bluebeard, let's go to the speech bubble.
In his tale, Bluebeard is a rich and ugly nobleman who has been married several times to beautiful women. One day, Bluebeard visits his neighbor and asks him if he can marry one of his daughters. The man, being reasonable, holds a banquet where Bluebeard can choose a daughter to be his wife. Bluebeard, being a man of culture, chooses the youngest one. Bluebeard takes his wife back to his mansion and tells him that he will be leaving for the countryside. He gives his wife the keys to all the rooms in his house and tells her that she is free to enter all of them except one. If she enters a forbidden room, he says, she will be killed. She, of course, enters the room anyway and finds the corpses of Bluebeard's former wives hung by meat hooks. Terrified, she drops the key in a pool of blood and runs away. Afterwards, the wife tries to clean the blood off the key, but finds she can't because the key is magical. Bluebeard arrives sooner than expected, sees the key, and threatens to kill his wife on the spot. The wife desperately asks Bluebeard for a final prayer, and he consents. At the last second, the brothers of the wife arrive and kill Bluebeard, and they live happily ever after with Bluebeard's fortune.
God, I hate the speech bubble. Anyway, the original Bluebeard explores the themes of curiosity and the dark side of marriage. The wife, overcome with curiosity, goes somewhere she is forbidden to go and pays the price. But you already knew that. Let's get to the good stuff. This story holds a special place among Perrault's works for its stance on marriage. In Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, marriage is seen as the ultimate goal of the female protagonist. Usually after getting married to the rich husband, the protagonist lives happily ever after. Bluebeard shows the darker side of marriage. By subverting the reader's expectations, Bluebeard shows the reader that marriage is not as simple as most fairy tales make it out to be. She threw herself at her husband's feet, weeping and begging his pardon, with all the signs of genuine regret for disobeying him. She looked so beautiful and so distressed that she would have melted a heart of stone, but Bluebeard had a heart harder than any rock. Bluebeard breaks from the typical fairy tales by having a character that subverts the reader's expectations. Unlike the usual fairy tale prince, who is kind and understanding, Bluebeard is cold and unforgiving. Bluebeard's remorseless attitude reveals the darker side of marriage. In this story, Bluebeard is replaced by a sorcerer. Similarly to Bluebeard, the sorcerer takes his wife to his house and gives her free reign. In this story, the sorcerer gives his wife an egg instead of a key and forbids her from going into one room in the house. The wife enters this room anyway, finds the corpses of the sorcerer's previous wives, and drops the egg into a pool of blood. Instead of breaking upon hitting the floor, the egg becomes bloodied and the stain on it won't go away. This causes the wife to be caught by the sorcerer, who kills her and replaces her with one of her sisters. After several sisters die, a sister with some sense comes around, decides not to carry the egg around with her, saves her sisters with some magic, and decides to trick the sorcerer. The sorcerer comes home to find the egg without blood on it, and says he will marry the sister. The smart sister tells him that her one condition is that he must carry a basket full of gold to her parents. In the basket, the wife hides her sisters, who were smuggled away by the sorcerer. She then decorates a skull by her window to make it appear as though she's in the house and makes her escape. After the sorcerer comes back, the wife's friends burn his house down with him in it. The entire story of Fitcher's Bird shows how women of intelligence can escape from destructive relationships. In many ways, Fitcher's Bird is a copy of Bluebeard, with some minor changes. The magical key that Bluebeard gives to his wife is replaced by an egg, which has the exact same function as the key, even becoming stained when the wife enters the forbidden room. The egg is meant to represent the lives of each of the sisters. By giving the sisters the egg before leaving, the sorcerer is telling them that they're holding their lives in their hands. The final sister, who prioritizes keeping the egg safe, is able to save herself and her sisters in the end. The title of the story is also symbolic. Birds in literature mainly represent freedom, and the title of the story alludes to the final sister's escape to freedom. The final sister is called Fitcher's Bird by the wedding guests when she makes her escape. By outwitting the sorcerer, the final sister earns her freedom and her revenge. "You have passed the test, and you shall be my bride." He no longer had any power over her and had to do her bidding. By outwitting the sorcerer, the wife gains an unprecedented power over him. By thinking for herself, the wife is able to outsmart the sorcerer and gain power over him, further reinforcing the theme that being intelligent makes you powerful.
Bluebeard has many morals and themes, the main one being a woman's disobedience to a husband. The tales of Robert Bridegroom and Mr. Fox, written by their brothers Grimm and Joseph Jacobs respectively, explore this theme by relying on a different variant of Bluebeard to tell its moral. In Robert Bridegroom, a suitor approaches the father and asks for his daughter's hand, which he gives her up because he thinks the suitor is a good person. On the path to the house, he tells her to lay a path of ash to find her way back, but she doesn't listen and instead makes the path of peas and lentils. At the house, she is left there and an old woman tells her the truth about these robbers, after which she observes the robbers slaughtering another daughter. It was at this point when she decides that none of that and escapes with the old woman by following the path of grown-up peas and lentils because the ash path was swept away. At the wedding, she tells a story about the dream she had where she recounts her experiences leading up to the point when the robbers cut a finger off of the victim, at which she produces the actual finger, providing proof for her story. After that, the daughter's family kill the robber. The story Mr. Fox by Joseph Jacobs is a successful marriage of Bluebeard and the Robert Bridegroom. The audience follow Lady Mary, who is young and is looking for the perfect man. Enter Mr. Fox, a brave, courageous, and very rich man. He decides to take her hand and tells her to go to his castle. He goes away on a trip, and she spends 2 days looking for it. When she sees it, she goes inside, and there are many warning signs written, but she ignores them and explores the castle. She eventually finds a room full of skeletons and bodies of young women laying everywhere. She decides to hide and sees Mr. Fox dragging another lady in. He takes a sword and cuts the victim's hand off with the ring. The hand flies through the air and lands in Mary's lap. Terrified, she takes the hand and runs away. The next day later, all the characters were having breakfast when Mr. Fox decides to ask Mary about the dream she had. She recounts everything that happened and displays the hand with the ring. Seeing that her story was genuine, her brothers cut Mr. Fox into 1,000 pieces. These two stories explore the subversion against the typical arranged marriage. Most fairy tales contain a complacent, vapid wife who is completely loyal to her husband. Robert Bridegroom and Mr. Fox challenge this norm with a female protagonist that contradicts everything the husband says. The story suggests that an arranged marriage will always lead to disaster, as represented by the young daughters that are dragged and eaten by the robbers. The dragging part represents the oppressive husband, and the cannibalism is the destruction of the wife's identity. Obviously, no one wants to get eaten, so the wife in the story matures out of a typical fairy tale marriage to become a person who could decide for herself. After the robbers die, she gets a husband of her choosing and lives happily ever after, which is a more realistic ending than what is in most fairy tales.
Not much later, a suitor turned up who seemed to be rich. And since the miller could find nothing wrong with him, he promised him his daughter. But the girl didn't care for him, as a girl should care for her betrothed, and she didn't trust him. Similar to the themes in Fincher's Bird and the original Bluebeard, Robert Bridegroom embraced a traditional norm by upsetting the image of the suitor and giving the bride intellect to save herself from destruction.
Unlike Perrault's original tale and the Grimm and Jacobs interpretations, all of which were published well over a century ago, Margaret Atwood's Bluebeard's Egg is very much a modern tale, published in 1983 in a collection of short stories. Gone are the fantastical, inverted idealisms of the classic tale, and in its place is a reimagining of the Bluebeard story without violence, death, or, strangely, blue beards. Bluebeard's Egg tells the story of a middle-aged couple, Sally and Edward, living a normal life. Sally is a woman who loves the idealistic ideas of a fairy tale happy ending. Sally looks down on Ed because she believes that he is boring and stupid. But one day, during a party, Sally happens upon Ed and her friend Marilyn performing only the lewdest of all actions, hand-holding. Also, Ed was touching Marilyn's butt, but hand-holding! Sally does not confront Edward about this, but as she goes to bed, she fears what she would discover if she tried to learn more about her husband. Atwood's interpretation takes the original themes of curiosity and the hard truths of marriage and spins it in a way that applies more to the modern day. Nowadays, people reasonably shouldn't be afraid that their spouse could be a psychopathic mass murderer collecting dead bodies in a random uncleaned room in the corner of their house. But infidelity is a very legit fear that comes with marriage. It's an issue that people don't really like to mention, even though studies show that there is a very real possibility that it will occur with any marriage. Like how the original Bluebeard handles the morbid truth of a wife's mortality in 17th century Europe, Atwood's story tackles the ideas of unfaithfulness in a modern day marriage. Similar to other variations, Bluebeard's egg covers marriage from an angle that other idealistic stories do not. Atwood best exemplifies the modern equivalent of Bluebeard's murder spree at the end of Bluebeard's egg, where she describes, quote, the egg, which is not small and cold and white and inert, but larger than a real egg and golden pink. The egg is alive, and one day it will hatch, but what will come out of it? End quote. The true fear and caution that Atwood creates is not one of mortality in marriage, but uncertainty. The egg, representing Ed, is revealed to be more than he seems, but his true nature is purposefully kept hidden from the reader to portray that we should be wary of what we don't know and what could be.
Bluebeard is a subversion of typical fairy tale depictions of marriage, showing the potential negative aspects of marriage that may not be evident on a surface level. The original Bluebeard is a sharp contrast to the princes depicted in other fairy tales. Fitcher's bird exemplifies the benefits of thinking for oneself in marriage. The Robert's bridegroom and Mr. Fox both show how people's true nature can be vastly different from how they appear initially. And Bluebeard's egg shows how the morals of Bluebeard can be applied to the modern day. So the big takeaway here is, when you get married, make sure your spouse isn't a homicidal maniac. Thanks for coming to our TED Talk.